Live. So, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning if you're watching this later. We are live again, and it's my absolute pleasure to be talking tonight to David Goodwin. David, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you today, Jose?
All the
Or this
better
evening,
for.
we could say.
Yeah. No, all the better for you being here. It's been one of those days where this is just the perfect recipe to take my mind off things and enjoy a good conversation. Um, Well, first of all, thank you for accepting my invitation to the podcast. I stumbled upon your biography of Lovecraft, very interestingly titled, I have to say.
Mhm. Thank you.
And but before we start talking about that, what prompted your decision to write uh, a biography, and in
hmm
particular about Lovecraft?
hmm well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to talk with you, and I'm really glad that a conversation about books can alleviate whatever challenges you may face in your day. I find any conversation about books is always welcome and a pleasing experience.
Indeed.
And it's really an honor and pleasure to talk with everyone watching today or watching later. And I'm really excited to hear their questions um, later on. So, what prompted me to write about H.P. Lovecraft, and what prompted me to write this particular book, Midnight Rambles, H.P. Lovecraft in Gotham? So, I would start with my own introduction to Lovecraft. So, I imagine, much like many people tuning in today, I discovered Lovecraft as a teenager. I still remember the collection that I read. It was a book, The Lurking Fear, from the Del Rey collection, which I think was published originally in the 1970s. I still remember the cover of that book.
Mm,
And the final story in that collection was The Shadow over Innsmouth. And I still recall the way that made me feel as a reader. And it really just amazed me as a reader of what was possible in fiction, what was possible in horror literature. And on and off as a reader throughout my teen years and my adult years and now my later adult years, I would return to Lovecraft periodically. But what prompted me to write this particular book? So my first book uh, came out in 2017, and I had a long promotion of that. And this was in the winter of 2018, I believe. And I read an article detailing how when Lovecraft lived in New York City, so this was the 1920s, 1924 to 1926 to be precise, uh, he would travel the New York City area far and wide. Uh, and one of his favorite places to visit was Elizabeth, New Jersey. And for those who do not know, Elizabeth, New Jersey is a small industrial city about a 20-minute train ride from Manhattan. And at that time in the 1920s, as it is today, Elizabeth is a heavily immigrant city. It's home to many new Americans, first and second generation Americans, and it was historically a manufacturing center and now a shipping center. So I found that really peculiar, knowing Lovecraft, knowing um, sort of his antipathy, shall we
mhm.
say, to
Yeah.
immigrants, many immigrants, to many new Americans, then and probably today, new Americans today would probably have a similar reaction to them. I found that really interesting. So why Elizabeth? And I went through his letters detailing his time in New York and specifically his visits to Elizabeth at that time. And he saw Elizabeth as a repository of colonial and early American architecture and buildings. So Lovecraft, for those listening who do not know, he was fascinated by 18th century um, buildings and spaces and culture in the United States. And when he spent most of his life in Providence, and that city is full of such buildings and spaces. And when he was living in New York, he traveled the whole area trying to find buildings, spaces, gardens, parks that dated from that period or embodied its artistic sensibility. And he saw Elizabeth as such a place, and I was able to find the guidebook that I believed he used on his travels through
Nice.
Elizabeth. And a friend and I then recreated ourselves on a very cold winter day in 2018. And I remember our cell phones froze up, so we couldn't take pictures.
Interesting.
And I thought, oh, maybe I'll write an article about this. And I began reading more, delving more into Lovecraft's letters, more into his relationship with New York City, reading more closely the small amount of short stories, of which there were 5 that he wrote in New York City. And then I realized I think there's a much larger story here. I think there may be a book here. And I spent the next several years researching, writing, editing, and editing and editing this book. And it was published in 2023. And what I hope to accomplish with this book, and readers will be the judge of that, and I apologize if I'm a little long-winded here, was to demonstrate how New York was integral to Lovecraft's development as a writer and as an individual. So throughout his life, Lovecraft discounted his New York experience. He saw it largely as lost years. He never passed by an opportunity to badmouth New York City once he had left. But I would contend Lovecraft's New York years is what allowed him to develop into the writer that many of us enjoy today. If you look at what he wrote before New York, some of it was good, but most of it, nothing outstanding. And then the stories that he wrote while living in New York, in a way, these are the stories that led him to his great stories, that being the Cthulhu mythos that many of us enjoy. And we see him in these New York stories experimenting with the raw materials that we later mine to write the Call of Cthulhu, to create the Case of Charles Dexter Ward and other tales. Also, living in New York allowed Lovecraft to realize how important New England, with its geography, its folklore, its history, how important it was to his writing and to his own imagination. Once he returned to Providence after New York, New England became the primary setting for his best stories. Also, a really key element, and this is really about Lovecraft as a person, we see in his New York years, is that his New York years undercut some of the myths or misconceptions about Lovecraft. Admittedly, many of these were perpetuated by Lovecraft himself. So Lovecraft often presented himself as a hermit or a recluse or sort of a man out of time. But when we look at his New York years, we realize he had this really rich social circle. And I imagine we'll talk about this more this evening. He spent part of every day with one friend or another while living in New York. So this was not an asocial person. This was not a person that was a man that chose to retreat from society because he felt he didn't fit within it. This was someone fully participating in the world, in the culture around him. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer, so I apologize for that. But that's the rough genesis of Midnight Rambles.
No, that's perfectly fine. You can talk as much as you want. I love listening to this.
Yeah.
And don't misinterpret me. Did you approach this book with a particular bias from one way or the other? Like, did you have some preconceived idea that you wanted to prove or disprove? Like, or were you like as cold and as factual as you could be? Because I think most of the time, whenever we approach something, we always go with the confirmation bias, or we're trying to disprove something. How neutral do you think you were in writing this book?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. How neutral? So, I mean, first of all, I approached it as someone who enjoys Lovecraft's stories. So I think one primary task or responsibility I placed on myself as a biographer and as a scholar was to not let that blind my writing or blind my exploration of anything that we might find controversial or disturbing in Lovecraft's biography. However, at the same time, I wanted to be fair. So I didn't want to have malign him necessarily, or just focus on the negative. And what I wanted to do, so the negative being, again, his beliefs on race, on immigrants, on minorities of every stripe, almost in American culture of the 1920s and the 1930s. Much of the writing about Lovecraft today, I think, focuses on that, and I think that's a valuable conversation to have and an important conversation to have. However, I wanted, or I was hoping to show him as a very complex and contradictory individual. So someone that we couldn't put in one box or another very easily. So, for instance, I think, and that took a great degree of, I should say, critical detachment to really strike that balance. But one thing that came out in the editing process of this book was some of the early readers came back, and there were elements they wanted me to maybe touch upon a little bit more. They actually said, spend a little more time talking about Lovecraft and race, for example, which I really try to get that out front in the introduction before we went to the text proper, because I think, again, that's important conversation to have. We get it out front early, and it's clear to the reader, I think, where I might be coming from.
Yep.
But that's a really interesting question. How did I say neutral? What sort of confirmation biases did I have? I think, again, like, the hardest thing is this is a character, a historic character, a literary character that I had a relationship with for decades as a reader. And someone I think really shaped my own imagination, shaped my love of fiction, my love of reading. But and that's fine. And I think that's good that I approached that. I didn't approach him as a fan, I shall say. But what that helped me do was not create a hagiography of him.
Yeah.
That I'm actually like, I know that I enjoy him as a reader. So how do I approach this as someone in a way that anyone who doesn't know about Lovecraft, how do I make this story compelling as well? I shouldn't assume the reader knows everything. I shouldn't assume even a longtime Lovecraft reader knows everything, which is something I've learned in the conversations I've had with people at book events, whether they're in libraries or bookstores, or even at Necronomicon, which is the big every other year conference in Providence, exploring Lovecraft and other people in Lovecraft circles. That many people come to the conference and they don't know as much as you might think, which is interesting. So as a biographer, you really need to, I guess, start the writing at the fundamental base level and work your way up. You can't assume the audience knows all these things you do. And I think a lot of writers, a lot of scholars sort of fall in that trap. They assume, oh, everyone's an expert. Everyone's just as fascinated about this as I am. And even someone that may have read everything by a certain author, they might know nothing about that author's life.
I mean, that happened to me with my current Call of Cthulhu RPG group. They've been playing for years, if not decades. And then when I start asking them, it's like, oh no, I haven't read Shadow over Innsmouth. No, I haven't read Dunwich Horror. And I'm like, how is that even possible? How can you delve into this world week in, week out, and not go to the primary source? Which is a very nice segue. What were your primary sources when getting all your information and all your facts to write the book? Is it the collection of letters, or is there any other sources there that I'm not aware of?
So that's a really great question. So as a biographer and a scholar, there's a wealth of primary sources related to the Lovecraft. So it's kind of a bounty of riches, and in a way, there may be too much, one might argue. But for those who don't know, Lovecraft was a prolific letter writer throughout his life. He wrote an estimated 100,000 letters and postcards. I believe the estimate is that 3,000 or so of those letters survive in one archive or another. Majority of those are housed at the John Hay Library at Brown University, which is a university in Providence, Rhode Island, Lovecraft's hometown. Many of those are digitized. So if someone's interested in looking at them, they can go online, they can read them. In fact, I would encourage anyone that wants to learn more about Lovecraft's biography to just read the letters, because they're fascinating documents. You really get a sense of his character. You really get a sense of his personality, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And you really see the range of his intellect. So in these letters, one letter might be a travelogue. One letter might go on a discursive discussion on astronomy. One might go on a discussion on history, Greek drama, American politics. So this is the gentleman from Providence who had a really wide-ranging, curiosities. And also, if I would encourage I would encourage people that are interested in learning more about Lovecraft to actually try to read the archival materials that are available online, because you really get a sense of his writing and his personality through his writing. But majority of those are published by Hippocampus Press, which is a small publisher outside New York City. So you don't have to worry about deciphering his handwriting if you don't want to. Yeah. Other raw materials, or primary materials, excuse me, that I utilize is Lovecraft kept a diary while living in New York in 1925 for 1 year. So we have a year where he notes down pretty much everything he did that day in the diary, each day. Also, he wrote almost daily letters to his aunts while living in New York. So that, coupled with the diary, we have a fairly good idea of what he was doing, who he was seeing, what he might have been writing, where he might have been walking while in New York City. Some other primary resources I looked at, a gentleman by the name of George Kirk, who was a bookseller. He was a very good friend of Lovecraft. He wrote letters to his fiancée in Cleveland, Ohio at that time. And that's actually the only contemporaneous source aside from Lovecraft's letters that we have for that time period. I also spent time going through the archives of Lovecraft's wife or ex-wife, and then eventually ex-wife Sonia Green at Providence, Rhode Island. She wrote multiple versions of an autobiography, which are housed in those archives, and to get a sense of her character, what her life was like. And she had a pretty fascinating life. I wish I could have gone deeper into it, but this was not her biography.
Next biography.
Next one, yeah. Actually, a scholar by the name of Monica Wasserman transcribed those autobiographies and made those available last year. So those are now available for purchase as well, at least in the United States. I don't know if they're available internationally or not.
So sorry to interrupt.
I'm sorry. Also, there are multiple memoirs by people that were in Lovecraft circles that I used. But also public records, census records, marriage records, photography, contemporary photographs of New York City at that time I delved into. So quite a bit.
Yeah. No, sorry, I was just going to ask, how dry was it reading Lovecraft's diary in New York? Like, woke up today, had toast, went for a walk, that sort of thing?
I mean, coupled with the letters, not too dry. Sometimes they were pretty pedestrian. You'd see like, oh, I did laundry today. Well, why are you writing this down? Like who? But,
literally, that's something that was in the diary.
Oh yeah. He would have like, oh, I went to the deli, or I cleaned my apartment, or his room. He didn't have an apartment; he rented a room. But then there was also very interesting things in there. You'd have his the places he visited that day. So for instance, there are two things that jump out to me right now that I think show the diary was not necessarily dry, but very revealing. So one, part of my book, Midnight Rambles, was looking at Lovecraft's relationship with his wife, Sonia Green, which I think has been underexplored, shall we say, by many writers, or undervalued in a lot of ways. And looking at his diary, looking at his letters, you realize this was a very complex, but in a way, a very loving relationship. And we have this image of Lovecraft as kind of an asexual individual. I think many of us have that image. But when you go into his letters, you go into the diary, you realize it might have not quite been that. And in fact, there's one note in his diary, and I made sure to mention this in my book, where he's meeting his wife at I believe at a train station. And he writes down either in his diary or in his letter, I can't recall off the top of my head, that she's wearing, I believe, a new gray dress or a new brown dress. And the fact that he's noticing from afar, like she's sitting at a table, and he notices her. He notices she's wearing a dress. That's a very revealing detail.
Mhm.
And someone that wasn't interested in someone romantically would not notice that detail. Also, elements in the diaries that are very revealing. So there was a period in 1925, I believe it was, where Lovecraft wanted to recommit himself to his writing. He thought he was socializing, gallivanting around too much in New York with his friends. So he said, I'm gonna hunker down. I'm not gonna socialize. I'm just gonna read. I'm gonna work on my fiction. And then you look in his diary and you realize that whole day he was out with multiple friends. So he had someone over at evening in his room, and then they went out to do something else. They went to the movies.
Mhm.
So the diary can be a little dry, but it also can be kind of revealing. So
Yeah. So back to this
Mhm.
image or portrait of Lovecraft that we may have had. Like,
Mhm.
I always found, because I didn't know much about his biography, so
Mhm.
yes, what I gathered from uh, prefaces to collected editions of his work,
Mhm.
or I think the first few editions of the RPG had a slight biography of
Mhm.
Lovecraft and a bit of a character portrait. So I always found, like, how did this guy that seemingly spent his time as a recluse in Providence writing for the pulp magazines
Mhm.
ends up marrying a divorcee and moving to New York? How did
Mhm.
that relationship with Sonia Green come about,
Mhm.
and how pivotal was her for that? I think 'cause she was the one that tried to take him to New York to
Mhm.
sort of make it big, isn't it?
Mhm. No, that's a great question. And again, one element in the book one element I really wanted to stress in the book was that relationship, because I felt that past writers had really given it short shrift, if you will. And how how did it develop? So in 1921, Lovecraft was attending a literary convention in Boston, Massachusetts. He was a member. He was prominent in a movement known as amateur journalism, which most people don't know anything about it today. There's really no reason for you to know anything about it, but it was a international network of writers and publishers that were sharing work and periodicals. So I compare it to the zine movement in the 70s and the 80s or 90s, or even I would say podcasts such as yours today, where it's people that are fascinated by one subject or another, and they just want to make connections with other people that
Hmm.
share that interest. Um, you could also look at compare it to the early days of blogging in the 2000s,
Yeah.
2010s. So Lovecraft was at this convention in Boston, and as the story goes, he was taking a boat ride with some friends throughout the harbor in Boston. And Sonia Gree saw Lovecraft from afar and wanted to be introduced to him. And she had traveled to New York with several other writers in this amateur journalism circle. And there's a picture of Sonia Green and Lovecraft on that boat, and he's laughing and she's smiling. I have that picture in my book. That is the only picture of them together that we know of.
Hmm.
It's very interesting. Uh, so the relationship was, shall we say, kindled at this amateur journalist convention, and they spent a period of time together during that convention in Boston. Not long thereafter, Green then visited Providence to see Lovecraft, and I document that visit in my book because I think it really shows this relationship burgeoning, and also
Hmm.
shows that it's truly a romantic relationship because you see how Green and Lovecraft are interacting. I mean, for instance, the first night in Providence, he takes her on a walking tour of all his favorite sites, wanting to show her the historic Providence that means so much to him. And then they linger together in the hotel lobby, not wanting that conversation to end, which I think is like a very romantic image of here's this somewhat reclusive, somewhat maybe socially maladept, or we think as someone is socially maladept, um, attempting to charm this woman who was, by all accounts, very stylish. She worked in the fashion industry. She was a hat maker. She was a bit more worldly than Lovecraft. She was divorced. She had an adult child. She was an immigrant, so she was of Jewish Ukrainian extraction. She came to the United States as a child. So a very interesting and also complex person herself, but also shows contradictions in Lovecraft, right?
Yeah,
So here is bemoaning immigrants invading the United States, complaining about Jewish Americans. And who is he becoming romantically attracted to? Someone who is from another country, someone who is Jewish herself, if not practicing. She definitely is culturally Jewish at that time. So that relationship, so this is 1921. Again, they met in Boston at the literary convention. She visits him in Providence shortly thereafter. And there are letters he's exchanging with his friends, really gushing over her at the time. Oh, she's this amazing person, this brilliant person. And then they take a few trips together, which is in itself very interesting, right? So it's a man that's not married, a woman who's not married, and they're traveling together. Okay. But then in 1922, he takes his first trip to New York. And that was largely spurred by Sonia Green, inviting him to stay with her and to meet other writers that he had only corresponded with, writers based in New York City. So in 1922, he comes to New York for the first time. He stays in Sonia Green's apartment. She stays in a neighbor's apartment and he makes sure to point that out in his letters that, she stayed with the neighbor. But she's the host and they see each other every day, and she's hosting dinner parties for Lovecraft and his friends. He meets her daughter, which that didn't appear to go very well. He visits her again in the fall of 1922. Interestingly enough, he makes no mention in his letter of her staying at a friend's house. So we don't know. Did they share the apartment together? We don't know. But we have to presume probably. But then, so the relationship is evolving over these period years. Again, 1921, they meet. He visits her in 1922. Now, unfortunately, Lovecraft did not keep any of his letters from Green, or they don't exist any longer. So we don't know what she was writing to him. Green destroyed all her letters from Lovecraft at some period. There's some debate over when. It might have been in the 1930s. It might have been a little bit later, but she did destroy them. So we don't really know the full details of how this relationship progressed, but it's clearly romantically progressing. And also, when you look at Lovecraft's letters to his friends, and he's talking about Sonia Green, we need to read between the lines a little bit, and we can see that he's attempting to solicit advice from them. As anyone would, as you or I would do if we were dating someone new and we weren't sure how to act or how to impress this person. We might ask our friends, "Oh, what do you think of her? What do you think of him? What do you think I should? What should we do on the first date?" But then on March 2nd, 1924, with presumably, or at least seemingly providing friends or family with no hint, Lovecraft gets on a train in Providence, a train going to New York City. And who meets him at the train station? Sonia Green. A day later, on March 3rd, 1924, they exchange wedding vows at St. Paul's Chapel in New York City.
So they must have planned and organized that in all those missing
right.
letters.
Oh, they clearly planned it out. But they didn't. It was kept kind of a secret. So the night before Lovecraft left, he visited a friend in Providence, another writer named C.M. Eddy, and Eddy's wife Muriel, and there was no talk of him leaving to New York to chase after Sonia Green. He mentioned he was going there to start a new career as a writer, or to break into the New York publishing world. He was already writing, so he had a career as a writer, but to really take it to the next level. So they were married in 1924, and that's what brought him to New York City.
Right. Okay. I think I know what your answer is going to be, but And I think if anyone knows this, please comment below. Let me know. Forgive me. I think it was John Houlihan, previous podcast guest and writer of sort of 19th century Cthulhu adventures and stuff like that. And I think he said, I think it was him, could have been someone else, I apologize, that if Lovecraft had never gone to New York, his life would have been better. That if he had just stayed in Providence and writing his stories and doing, because those years in New York were sort of fairly, they impacted him negatively, and that maybe he would have been better off staying in Providence. What's your take on that?
I would say no. I would
Okay.
say no, and I would say
I
that
thought you might say that.
I wrote the book on his New Yorker years, right? So I would hope that I would defend them. But I think, and I think we touched upon this. If we haven't touched upon it now, I know we were chatting about this before we went live. That I think New York was important to him for two primary reasons. One, it allowed him to develop into the writer that did write the Call of Cthulhu, that did write the Shadow of Innsmouth, that did write At the Mountains of Madness. If we look at what he wrote before New York, most of those stories aren't particularly great. I mean, they may be decent enough stories, but I don't think we would be reading them 100 years later. Or maybe there might be one we'd read in some collection of, horror and science fiction stories from the early 20th century.
Yeah.
But I don't think Lovecraft would have this international reputation. I don't think he would influence pop culture in the way, and high culture in the way he does today. So New York, I would contend, really allowed him to develop into the H.P. Lovecraft that we know, that we read. And look at what he wrote in New York. So he wrote 5 stories. A few of them, the Horror at Red Hook, Horror at Red Hook in particular, I'd say we start seeing the elements that we associate with the Cthulhu mythos. So we see one, that Lovecraft's New York stories were set in a real world, and a real world that we would recognize, that readers would recognize. And if you look at his Cthulhu mythos stories, those are set in a real world. Now, the setting might be fictionalized, right? There is no Innsmouth, right? But there is no Arkham. But it looks like the world of the 1920s. It looks like the world of the 1930s. I mean, these are real people operating within a reality that a reader would understand. That's in the Horror at Red Hook. Also, the Horror at Red Hook, we begin to see in Horror at Red Hook details a cult that spans the globe, that has some nefarious purpose or another, which that's central to the Call of Cthulhu. That the Cthulhu cult, it spans ages, it spans countries. It's so those are some of the elements we see in his early New York stories. But also, I think living in New York, this is the first time he lived outside of Providence, really his first time away from his family. We see him begin to understand how important New England, how important Rhode Island, how important Providence was to his writing, to his sense of self-identity. And when he returned to Providence from New York, that's when he really begins mining the geography of New England, the folklore of New England, the history of New England, the folkways of New England, to flesh out his fiction, to create this rich fictional world that has inspired film and role-playing games and video games and television shows and music and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think also the other element is New York really provided Lovecraft with a rich social circle. So for those who don't know, Lovecraft's early life really was marked by a lot of sadness, a lot of loss. His father was institutionalized when he was 3 years old. His father later died in a mental health facility. Lovecraft's mother had a similar fate when Lovecraft was a young adult. She was institutionalized, and then she later died in a mental health facility, Butler Hospital, which was the same hospital where his father lived and died as a patient. Lovecraft never graduated from high school. He attended school on and off as a adolescent and as a teen. He claimed there were physical issues that prevented him from going to school. This clearly was a badge of shame for him. He was always obfuscating about his lack of a proper education to friends and to acquaintances. But when he was living in Providence, he did lead a fairly isolated life. I mean, he had correspondence. He would talk with via letters. Sometimes these people would visit Providence. He would take some day trips outside of Providence. But it did seem fairly isolated. But then he moves to New York, and all of a sudden he becomes part of a literary circle. This circle was known as the Calum Club. So it was a group of several writers or people that worked in the book industry. And Lovecraft would share part of almost every day with one member or other of the Calum Club. So he had in New York this gift of friendship that he never had before. He would never possess that again. So when he moved back to Providence, he in many ways slipped back into this semi-isolated existence. Again, he would travel to visit friends. Friends would come visit him, but he didn't have a circle of friends that he would, meet for coffee with once a month, or just meet to talk about fiction once a month or whatnot. So I think New York, one, again, allowed him to develop into the writer that we know and that we love, but also on a personal level, it allowed Lovecraft to really experience rich friendships in a way that he had not before. Now, Lovecraft himself always discounted his New York experience as negative. In fact, one of his New York stories, he begins with the narrator claiming that his coming to New York had been a mistake. And that in many ways mirrors Lovecraft's own thoughts on New York when he was writing and later when he left. So I would say no. It was important for Lovecraft to come to New York. As difficult as some of the experience was for him, I think he did benefit from it.
Right. And I think it's got to the time where we have to address the elephant in the room.
Let's do it.
It's something that has been talked about, and we mentioned before going live. This is a question that I've got for you from Susana Imaginario. It's a friend of the channel, Slipstream writer. Right, so she says, my impression of Lovecraft is that he was critical of some cultures and mass immigration in general, you've already mentioned. But the question is, was he really a racist? And then she qualifies that as racism was defined back then. Or is this reputation the result of modern sensibilities?
That's a great question. And
Susana
I think
always makes great questions, and she always raises the level of any conversation. I mean, so.
And her name was Suzanne?
Susana Imaginario.
Susanna, thank you for the question. Thank you for watching. So was his racism just a reflection of his his contemporary sensibilities, or was it something else? So I would say, one, this is a tricky question and a complex question. So I'm going to try to walk through it carefully. So first of all, I would contend that yes, 1920s America was a very casually racist time. So that I don't think any student of history would say otherwise, or an honest student of history would say otherwise. And if you look at popular publishing, there were all sorts of stereotypes within, whether it's immigrant groups or Black Americans, or pick a group, we could find some stereotypical representations in various publications and films, whatnot. But Lovecraft definitely trafficked in an extreme view on immigration and on race. So this wasn't just some sort of off-the-cuff remarks he was making. In his stories, okay, I apologize that I'm stumbling a little bit here, but his stories, I think, for the most part, with the exception of the horror Red Hook, which you read that is dripping with bile against the other, as we might think of it today. Most of his stories, you might read it, and we were talking about this, Jose, before we went live. I believe that much of it just sort of maybe goes over your head, or you sort of dismiss it as, oh, that's the way people wrote in 1924 or 1925 or 1928. But when you get in his letters, this is when you see the real darkness behind his belief system. So, for instance, in his letters, from New York City, he writes about He writes about how he was riding the subway and he fantasized about shooting Jewish Americans who were on the train with him.
Mm-hmm.
Also, we see him writing in a mock black dialect to his aunt in his letters. Presumably, this was acceptable in his household if he's writing to his aunt that way. In another letter, and this goes back to when he first visited New York in 1922, he talks about walking through the Lower East Side in Chinatown. So the Lower East Side at that time was a heavily Jewish immigrant neighborhood. And he talks about how, one, he wanted to walk in the middle of the street so he didn't have to actually touch anyone in the neighborhood on the sidewalk. And then he talked about possibly gassing the neighborhood as a prophylactic move. So there's many instances of that in his letters. One instance I can think of off the top of my head in New York, from his New York experiences, there was a July 4th where he and his wife, Sonia Green, went to visit Pelham Bay Park, which is a large park in the Bronx. There's a beach in the park. And he was aghast that it was full of Black Americans, and he wanted to go right home. So he didn't want to be in the same public space with minorities. Now, here's where we get to the complexity of the things. So we're reading that, say, oh, he must be an awful, dyed-in-the-wool racist. He must be a horrible person. Well, then we look at who does he socialize with? Who is he choosing to spend time with? And this is where it gets a bit frustrating, I would say, or bedeviling for us as readers or as biographers or as scholars, is that, one, who did he marry, right? Yeah. We were talking about his wife earlier, Sonia Green. She was a Jewish Ukrainian immigrant. In fact, she wasn't even a U.S. citizen when they were married. She only became a citizen in 1925 on his birthday, which is not coincidental. That cannot be coincidental. Yeah. And we know she spoke Yiddish at home to her daughter. Sonia Green's mother lived nearby. She had extended family nearby. Also, he had other good friends that fit into these negative categories that Lovecraft might hold. So another good friend of his was Samuel Loveman, who was a poet from Cleveland, Ohio. Loveman was a Jewish American, second generation American. His parents immigrated from what was then the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Loveman was also gay. He might not have been out in the way we might think of it today, but it wasn't a secret that he was gay. His friends definitely knew it. And this did not bother Lovecraft. He considered Loveman one of his dearest friends, one of his closest friends. Also, James Morton was another individual in Lovecraft's circle. Morton was kind of a wild character into himself. He was involved in radical politics. He was the first curator of the Patterson Museum in Patterson, New Jersey. But he was also a dedicated advocate for civil rights for Black Americans and Jewish Americans. This was another individual that Lovecraft considered one of his closest friends. So we see these contradictions, that he's in print, right? He's writing about these groups, these individuals, maligning them in really brutal and ugly terms. But then who does he choose to spend his time with? So it's very contradictory. Another instance that comes to mind in his New York years is one day he and his wife traveled to Coney Island, which is, if anyone knows, is this sort of legendary amusement park area in Brooklyn on the beach. I was actually just there a few days ago myself, so you can still go if you're in New York City. And at that time, there were many, I'm not sure what we'd call them now, but then they were calling them freak shows, filled with different people with different physical disabilities, one stripe or another. And he talks about one of these performers who was known as Zip the Pinhead. And he had a large head, small head, large head. He had some deformity with his head. I I can't recall off the top of my head exactly what the medical term is.
Mm.
But interesting enough, in Lovecraft's letters, when he's talking about it, he never maligns this person for his disability. And in 1920s America, people that were disabled were seen as second class citizens. Like they weren't mentally capable of, regardless of what their mental abilities were. They weren't seen as mentally capable of being full citizens. That they didn't have the capability to weigh in on conversations in public life, or people argued they shouldn't even vote necessarily.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of discrimination against those that were disabled, either physically or mentally or developmentally. But Lovecraft never said that. He never talked about Zip or anyone else that was disabled as being a lesser person, which actually put him in an enlightened position for his time. But getting really back to the discussion of Lovecraft and race, I do think it's important for us to acknowledge it, because I don't want to say many, but there are people that are Lovecraft scholars or within the Lovecraft world that really try to dismiss it as, oh, this was just a product of his time. And then we can kind of push that conversation to the side, not deal with it. And I think that's being dishonest. And I think that's also allowing Lovecraft then to be dismissed by people that might be offended, or might be grossly offended by his beliefs on race. I imagine we're all offended by them, but someone that would say, I can't read his works because of that.
Yeah.
I can't enjoy his writing because of that. So one, we're leaving his works vulnerable to those charges if we don't talk about race. But also, what unfortunately I have noticed is there are elements that think his beliefs were correct, and that we should be embracing them. And unfortunately, last year, a website, a white nationalist website, wrote a 4-part positive biography on my book. And part of it was that they thought these beliefs on Lovecraft were great. And they actually thought my book, throughout my book, I point out things Lovecraft might have said about race or minorities, or about minorities, or about immigrants, and then try to analyze it, try to critique it. And one commentator actually said, oh, this is a great book because now I know where I can find the evidence to support my own beliefs.
Okay.
Yeah, so if we don't talk about Lovecraft and race, I think that is a dangerous possibility that those individuals will embrace his work and promulgate it. Not readers such as you and myself and everyone watching today who are really trying to have these complex conversations. All the while we say, hey, we love these stories. We love these games, Call of Cthulhu. We love the movies based on his work. But at the same time, we need to have a conversation about maybe some not so pleasant things about the person behind them.
But there's two things that spring to mind. I don't know how to. Okay, so the most obvious one, I think I had this conversation with, it was with John Julian, I think it was, that whether then we need to analyze the personality of any artist from the past, and that's a very complicated way to live your life, because you can pick any major artist from, Picasso was a terrible misogynist. The way he treated women and his wife was horrendous. No one talks about that. We still think of Picasso as one of the great, revolutionaries of the arts, and that's not an issue. But somehow Lovecraft is an issue. So I don't know. Now, recently, we had the whole Neil Gaiman situation as well. But does it mean that we have to do a background check and we need to read 2 or 3 biographies of every artist from the past before we can actually go and enjoy the work? And that seems to be very complicated. And to for the layman, I think a separation of the work from the artist is, I'm not going to say necessary, but is the path of least resistance to actually enjoy great works of art.
Well, I think I would more or less concur with what you just said, that I think if we start tossing out artists that have disagreeable background, shall we say, we're not going to have much to read. We're not going to have much to listen to. We're not going to have much to enjoy in a museum, because most artists, like most people, have led complicated lives and have done things that we might not agree with. I think if you're writing a biography on the artist, then that's when you have to delve into those issues.
Obviously, yeah,
But if I'm watching, I mean, the Neil Gaiman is a very contemporary question, right? So that's happening in real time. So it'd be interested in, say, 20 years.
Yeah.
What are we talking about when we talk about Neil Gaiman? Lovecraft, I think why his beliefs have come to the forefront recently is that, I mean, the show Lovecraft Country came out. That was based on the book Lovecraft Country. And that really introduced Lovecraft to a whole new audience that knew nothing about him. And I think that might have helped spur that conversation. Also, what was the novel? The City We Became by K. Jesmond, I believe the author's name. That talked a little bit about Lovecraft and his beliefs. So there've been some works that have come out that have tried to present his beliefs in a way as a character themselves. I think Lovecraft Country, that's where we see that. I remember in the novel, and especially the first episode of the show, his beliefs, not even him, were in a way a character. So I think that might be it. I also think just the current political climate in the United States, and I know other countries throughout Europe, that might be sort of spurring those conversations. But I do largely concur, though, that we have to have a separation from the artist and his or her work.
Yeah. Also, isn't it getting a little bit Orwellian, where we are judging someone by their thoughts, not by their actions?
Right.
And as far as you're aware, he didn't act on any of those thoughts or beliefs that he had, didn't he? And it was contradictory himself. So, we're getting sort of fairly, Orwell got a spot on with 1984. I mean, that book, he must have had a crystal ball or something, but, we are in that situation, isn't it? It's the thought crime.
Mm-hmm. Right. Again, yes. And I'm glad you pointed that out. Lovecraft actually, there's no evidence of him actually ill-treating anyone. So by all accounts, he was always very gentlemanly, very polite to everyone he interacted with. That was something all his friends years later really pointed out, that it was he was almost this old world gentleman or nobleman, if you will, in the way he talked to people. So he would talk to a street sweeper the same way he would talk to a professor, very respectfully, and again, there is no evidence of him attacking anyone in public or yelling at someone in public. But yeah, it was in his letters, and those were private exchanges. You could argue those weren't meant for public consumption. So I would argue we should not. I mean, I wouldn't have written this book if I thought we should toss out his fiction. I don't think we should toss out. I mean, maybe there's an extreme case you could present to me, but I'm sure we. But I think in general, I would not toss out any artist's work due to something that artist did privately.
Yeah.
I think, again, it helps us analyze. It gives us the different lens to look at that artist's work, right? So I think one contemporary example. So Kevin Spacey.
Yeah.
So if we look back at some of his films from the 90s, knowing what we know about him now, it's kind of interesting. Like there's sort of this art imitating life in a way aspect to them. But I don't think I watched LA Confidential again recently, and this is an amazing movie, and I wouldn't, or
Usual Suspect.
Beauty, I think, is 25 years out now, or 20. Actually, that was last year. Was 25 years out, but that's another one that I.
Okay, I got a couple more questions from the community. Right. I don't know if this is from Susanna or her husband David, but here we go. Okay. His work was generally overlooked and unappreciated in life, and maybe you can qualify that. What changed after his death? I think I've got an answer for that. But
Mhm.
and what aspect? So right, and then what aspect of his work or mythos do you believe were crucial to his success and relevance over the decades?
Hmm.
So
Okay.
what was he overlooked and unappreciated? What changed after death? What
Mhm.
were the themes that made him so relevant?
So he was definitely. I mean, he died relatively penniless. He made very little money off his fiction throughout his life. He primarily wrote in pulp magazines. Weird Tale was his
Yeah.
publication of choice. And they're called pulp magazines for a reason, right? They're not; these are not high-end glossies.
You know
They
what
were
I found?
disposable magazine. They were
You know
just
what I found out? Yeah, because I was talking to John Jarrell, a horror agent, and he said that those pulp magazines from the 20s and 30s used to arrive to the UK as ballast for boats,
hmm
and they
hmm
would just dump them on the ports in the UK,
hmm
and that's where people will get old copies of Weird Tales and these kind of magazines where Robert E. Howard, H.P. Lovecraft will write their stories.
I've heard that too. I've heard that too, that they were used as ballast for ships.
Yeah, yeah,
That shows you the value of the.
yeah, exactly.
but but I mean, there was a period where he was one of the more prestige writers in Weird Tales. So it was Robert
Mhm.
E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith and H.P. Lovecraft, probably the at one point in time the better known writers in Weird Tales. But when he died, he was more or less by the time at the end of his life, while he was nearing his death, he was more or less Lovecraft was more or less convinced his work would be forgotten. That, and he even says, I actually begin my book mentioning this when he's writing from his desk in Providence, lamenting sort of his his lack of a literary legacy. That he felt like as a writer he was further away from what he wanted to accomplish 10 years ago. So he more or less thought himself as a failure. Now we might ask, was that a creation or that was a myth he was trying to create as a writer? Maybe, but yes, Lovecraft died in 1937, pretty much broke, living in a rented room in Providence, living a fairly hand-to-mouth existence. Now, almost immediately after his death, two other writers, August Derleth and Donald Wandry, began collecting Lovecraft's publications, whether in manuscript form or also in published form, with the goal of publishing him in print, publishing him
Mhm.
in a hardcover volume, realizing that if he wasn't published, his stories would um, likely be forgotten. So in 1939, they published The Outsider and Others, I believe it was the title, was the first publication of Arkham House Publishing,
Mhm.
which I think is defunct now. It sort of periodically will sort of be resurrected
Yeah.
here, but I think I was attempting to get some material from them for my book, and that conversation died off. So I have a feeling, at least right now, they're no longer in this world. Um, and so, again, 1939, this book was published. This marked the beginning or the reemergence of Lovecraft. And then in World War II, um, there there was a series of books that were published for men and women serving in the armed forces of the United States, known as the Armed Services Edition, I believe they were called.
Mhm.
And the goal was to get literature in the hands of men and women serving in the armed forces, whether domestically or overseas. And one of those books was the Dunwich Horror and Other Stories, it was Dunwich Horror and Other Stories, Dunwich Horror and Other Tales, but a collection of Lovecraft stories. So all of a sudden, this was getting in the hands of Marines and sailors, soldiers. Um, and then those books began being discovered by creative people. So we have Stephen King, probably the most known horror writer of the United States of the late 20th and early 21st century,
Mhm.
remembers finding a paperback. I believe it was called The Lurking Fear, which was published in the 1940s, I believe, um, in a box of his father's items in his grandparents' house. So Stephen King, I think, if I remember correctly, he was might have been living with his grandparents at the time, and he found this box in the garage of books and other things from his father's His father, I think, walked out on the family. Things that came from his father.
Yeah.
And then this was a Lovecraft book. And he recounts this in one of his memoirs about discovering this book and how it just was such an influential work on him in his own writings. We also hear other writers. So the director, John Carpenter, recounts reading The Rats in the Walls in a collection of horror stories published by the Modern Library. So Lovecraft begins seeping into these various publications, and people that would go on to be very influential writers or filmmakers discovered his works. And that's, I would suspect, what led to his sort of slow creeping entry into sort of our popular culture imagination. And then in the 1970s, there were a series of paperbacks released under the Del Rey imprint, which was a imprint, I think, of Ballantine books at that time, that really got those in the hands of a lot of readers. So again, over the course of several decades, his works were issued in different forms, and different writers, different filmmakers, different artists discovered them. And I think then they planted sort of references to them in their own works, which then other generations of readers would discover those references and like, who's this Lovecraft guy? And they'd go to the library, check out a book, go to the bookstore, buy a book. I believe, that if I'm remembering correctly, that's how I heard of Lovecraft. I caught a reference to him in some novel or another, or some film. Actually, I think I saw the Reanimator. Film, and I was like, who's this Lovecraft guy? And then I went and tracked down some of his fiction. But what the other question to that?
It was the themes,
right. What are the themes? And I apologize, like some of my questions kind of are discursive and go in different directions, but
it's fine.
I hope it's entertaining for folks, or at least engaging.
I'm loving it. So
yeah. But what are the themes? I think what makes Lovecraft's better stories, and I talked about how I remember reading The Shadow over Innsmouth, and how that really opened up this sort of world of storytelling and fiction to me that I had never conceived of. And I imagine everyone that has discovered Lovecraft has a similar experience where they read one story or another, and it just sort of like, blew their mind open. But I think the world building aspect, that in his Cthulhu Mythos tale, he's building, these are loose, the Cthulhu Mythos, for those who do not know, is this loosely interlocking series of stories and novellas that evolve around men, and they're always men, who are these educated individuals, sometimes a professor or an archaeologist or a scientist, who stumbles upon knowledge that these malevolent alien creatures once lorded over the earth, and now they're returning. And their second coming will herald the end of human civilization, right? So all our greatest accomplishments, whether it be art or science or religion or history, they're going to be wiped out when Cthulhu and his brethren reemerge. And these scientists and historians and librarians, they discover the existence of Cthulhu and the human beings in their service. And that's roughly sort of the plot of most of those stories. And then these individuals, again, the main characters, the scientists, the historians, they try to hide this knowledge, knowing that it creeping out will sort of shatter this shell of civilization that we've constructed around ourselves. So I think Lovecraft creating this world, within the Cthulhu mythos, in the sense, Cthulhu mythos is full of like these references to forbidden books and long ago forgotten histories. It's creating this really rich, layered world. And I think that is what has really impacted readers and really sort of stuck with them over time. Again, I mean, some of his one-off stories are really great. I like Pickman's Model. That's a great one. But they don't have sort of the depth and the complexity that the Cthulhu Mythos tales do. And I think that is what has ensured Lovecraft's place in the literary pantheon.
I would add to that. I don't know if you've doubled, but I think the RPG has had a massive influence in keeping the flame alive, so to speak. And for anyone that hasn't done so, please check my interview with Sandy Peterson, the creator of the Call of Cthulhu RPG, because that's how I got to hear about H.P. Lovecraft. It was like the geeky guys in my classroom were like, "Oh, we do this thing called Call of Cthulhu. What is that?" And then from there, here we are.
Yeah, and that, I mean, I've played that. It's a really fun game, and I think you're right too. And it also allows the reader to contribute to that world building, because it's not a dungeon master, as Dungeons and Dragons. The dungeon master is the one that runs the game. I'm not sure, the gamekeeper, shall we say, for Call of Cthulhu.
Keeper of the law is the
keeper of the lore. He or she then is contributing to this world that Lovecraft himself constructed, and so you have this interplay between the reader and the writer. And it's, I would agree, that's probably introduced many people to Lovecraft, and to other writers in the Lovecraft circle.
Yeah. I've got one more question from the Carl D. Albert, one of the members in the Page 2 community.
Hey, Carl.
His question is, how did religion influence Lovecraft's writings? Interesting.
I mean, I would say at best, Lovecraft was a-religious, and he was avowedly agnostic. He was a materialist. So what that means is he didn't believe there was any sort of religious or spiritual force guiding the world or guiding the universe in any way. And he actually had a fairly grim view of the universe, in the sense that he thought man was relatively meaningless in a larger cosmos, and we see this in the Cthulhu Mythos tales. But in his own life, so let's sort of take a few steps back. He was raised Baptist. Rhode Island is where the Baptist Church was founded in the United States. This is a Protestant sect, for those who don't know the history of Protestantism in the United States, which I don't expect you to.
You got far too many churches over there.
But the First Baptist Church is in Providence, and that was where Lovecraft and his family worshipped, or attended, shall we say. I actually learned that I had a relative that was a parishioner there at one point, which I feel like I was part of a Lovecraft story myself.
There you go.
When I learned that. So I believe it was a great grandfather, if I'm not mistaken, on my side, not Lovecraft's. But Lovecraft, from an early age, disavowed any belief in a Christian God. He claims he had some sort of altercation with a Sunday school teacher, and his mother then pulled him out, and he stopped going to school. And he would have been probably a preteen at that time. I can't recall the exact age. And at that point, he claimed he no longer believed in God in the way anyone in the Western, in the West, not even the Western world, but any of the Abrahamic religions would. And he was, but again, so this is again showing his complexity. So what role did religion play? So he saw religion as a civilizing force. So he actually thought religion's value was creating a sense of tradition and history for people. And again, when we were talking about Lovecraft and his marriage to Sonia Green, I mentioned he was married at St. Paul's Chapel in Lower Manhattan, which might strike people as interesting. Like, well, wait a minute, Lovecraft, he was not a believer. He wasn't practicing in any way. So why did he want to be married in a church? And he wanted to be married in this particular church because it embodied the sense of history and tradition. So it was the oldest house of worship in Manhattan, which is also Lovecraft's. And it also was an Episcopal church, which is the American equivalent of the Church of England, for those. And again, it's a Protestant offshoot for those who are unaware of that lineage. Lovecraft's parents were married in an Episcopal church, so he wanted to exchange wedding vows in a place that allowed him to sort of soak in this history and tradition. So I would say from a place of his personal beliefs or his personal philosophy, he saw religion again as the civilizing force that allowed us to have a sense of history and meaning. But he didn't think there was anything behind it. So he didn't believe in any sort of God or any sort of spiritual force or being in which, anyone who believes in one faith or another, they think there's something out there, right? So we may not know what it is, but there's something. But it's interesting. So when we look at Lovecraft's stories, and I think that was the real question, what role did religion play in his writing? And we talk about the Cthulhu cults, and we talk about the other entities worshiping Cthulhu or Dagon or these other creatures. Cthulhu is a real world being. He's not a god. He may have godlike powers. And he may have powers that are beyond human comprehension. But he's still in the corporeal world. So it's interesting that these cults are worshiping an entity that's living and breathing. But you would think the way he writes, he's writing about secret cults and ancient sects and sort of forbidden religious tomes, that he himself might have been a believer one sort or another, but no, he was not. So I hope that answered the question. But
but we'll see. We'll see what Carl says. I've got one final question, not because I want to leave, because I'm really loving it, but still a school.
I am. I'm enjoying myself.
I'm sorry for anyone that has heard me say this for the 100th time, that the short story is the natural habitat for the horror tale. I think, and you mentioned before, I cannot help myself. I just don't think Stephen King is a horror writer. He just writes, I don't know, paranormal stuff, but you cannot have horror on an 800-page novel. It's just, to me, it doesn't make sense. But like I said, short story is the natural habitat for horror, but I also feel that it's got a sense of disposability. I was having a look through Amazon. There are so many horror anthologies published every year that you could almost read nothing else if you wanted. So they feel very disposable to me. And yet, Lovecraft's works are something that I go back to periodically, to go and reread and revisit all those stories that actually have staying power. You remember those stories, unlike many other horror stories. I think it kind of ties up with the earlier question. Why do you think that is?
Why are
Lovecraft's horror stories have got that staying power and that ability to bring you back time and time again that I think many other horror stories don't have?
I mean, interesting. So I think looking at Lovecraft as a writer, right? I think the fact that we return to his works again and again and again, and I think we were talking about this earlier, how many of us discovered him as a younger person, and then we periodically over the years will read him again, and we're reading him differently. We're seeing different things. We're reading different things, and I think that shows his true power as an artist and as a writer. That he's I don't want to throw around the word genius. I don't want to throw that around loosely, but clearly he's not an average writer. We could have a whole discussion whether what classifies a genius or not. But this is someone of real talents and real vision in the sense of the world he's creating. But what makes it? Why do we keep returning to it? I think that there is something very unsettling and otherworldly about his writing, in the sense that again, his better works, we're immersed in a world that we would understand, right? They're set in the real world, whether that be Arkham, Massachusetts, or Providence, Rhode Island, or Boston, Massachusetts. They're set in places we could see ourselves walking through, exploring, living in. And then all of a sudden, these events or these entities or these things happen that sort of puncture that world and show us that all that we thought might be just sort of this facade, that there's another world operating behind it that's very dark, that's very sinister, and that doesn't really care about us. So maybe that's why. But again, I think he created something truly unique in the Cthulhu mythos, something that no writer had done before. Where again, they're not necessarily sequels or prequels, but they are, interrelated. But I do think the short story medium, I never thought about that before, but I think you're onto something, in the sense that it might be it might be the vehicle for horror. And again, I think Poe wrote about this. I think when he was writing about short stories in his writing philosophy, that he thought the best piece of writing should be read in one sitting. So whether that be a poem or a short story, that the most superior form would be read in one evening, or on a ride on the subway, or I don't know, you're sitting in the waiting room of doctor's office and you have 30 minutes to kill. Where a novel, right? We read a novel a period of days, a period of weeks, and it's a different experience. I won't say it's a lesser experience, but it's a different experience. But yeah, I never thought about that before. But
it's just
the better horror stories, or the better horror fiction that I would recommend to people are always short stories. They're not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I can think of a few great horror novels, but none of them I say are necessarily perfect works. Where we can probably point out some short stories where we think, oh, this is a perfect short story, right? Whether it be Lovecraft or Poe or another writer.
I think those are the two masters, Poe and Lovecraft. I've got several anthologies from, the masters of horror, M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, and I could pick one of those anthologies now, and I wouldn't remember any of them. It would be like reading them anew. But Lovecraft and Poe, you read them once, they stay with you. They have something there, and I think whatever that something is, it is that genius that you were talking about before.
And the fact, again, like we were talking about how Lovecraft, most writers won't be read beyond their lifetime. That's just the reality. And no writer wants to hear that, but I think most writers know that. Unless you create something that's truly original and truly moving. And I think that Lovecraft's fiction has been with us over 100 years, and we're still reading it. We're still finding new things about it. And again, I think new people are always discovering him, new readers, and then they're repurposing Lovecraft into their own works, whether that's role-playing games such as Call of Cthulhu, or movies such as those by Guillermo del Toro, which are heavily Lovecraftian films. So we see again and again him being rediscovered and repackaged and retooled, and that I think shows how innovative and interesting and original and fresh those works still remain. And maybe that might be something he shares with Poe, where you can read Poe short stories and it could have been written today, and it doesn't. And where sometimes we read something that was written 20 years ago and it seems dated.
Right. Mr. Goodwin, I'm sorry and I'm sad to have to call it a day, but it's been an absolute pleasure having you here tonight.
It's been a real pleasure, a real honor, and I'm really happy that we were able to share this time together, and I'm really flattered so many people had such great questions.
Before we go, where can people find you, social media, your work?
Sure. So my website is davidjgoodwin.com. You can go there. You can find out about anything I've been working on as far as writing, if I'm speaking at any events. I am currently on Twitter, Blue Sky, and on Facebook. I don't post too much in either of those, but you can always DM me and I definitely will get back to you. If people are listening and they have questions, you can fill out the contact form on my website and I will respond. Yeah, that's actually how I was invited to this show.
I was going to say, and you do. So thank you very much to you. And there's a few lurkers in the chair, very aptly tonight. There's a few lurkers that have been watching, haven't said anything. So
that's okay.
Whoever they are, and to all the listeners of the podcast from literally all over the world, everyone, take lots and lots of care, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Take care. Thank you for inviting me again, Jose.